Hi, and welcome to another live episode of Marketplace Masters, brought to you by Merchant Spring, the leading marketplace analytics platform for Amazon agencies and vendors. Marketplace Masters is all about going deeper into the challenges that brands and agencies face to lift performance via a set of practical actions and insights. I'm your host, Paul Sonneveld, and today we're going over the fundamentals of the Amazon vendor platform and how to set yourself up for success. To help me do this, I've invited James Wakefield to join us and share his expertise. James is the founder of Wake Commerce, a London-based Amazon agency and technology provider firmly focused on Vendor Central. James has been selling on marketplaces since 2002 and on Amazon since 2005. So he brings a broad range of experience to the conversation today. Thank you for joining us on the show, James.
Thank you for having me, Paul. Appreciate it.
Today we're talking about a very exciting topic, Amazon vendor, going over the fundamentals. It's a topic that we don't often talk about, or in fact, even on LinkedIn, there's not a lot of content specifically on the Amazon vendor platform. So I'm delighted you can join us today. So let's kick straight off. Let's lay the foundation here. Maybe explain to me and our audience, in layman terms, what is Amazon Vendor Central?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me on. Essentially, you've got two quite distinct selling models on Amazon. Seller Central is obviously the most well-known. We think there's about 6 million sellers globally. Anyone can register, and it's where you're essentially selling directly to Amazon's customers. You're responsible for orders, shipments, customer service, stock replenishment. There are nuances within that dependent on what kind of fulfillment you're using, but I'm not going to kind of go into that today. Vendor Central on the flip side it's an invite-only platform. It's where you're supplying to Amazon on a wholesale basis, and then Amazon essentially own that stock, and they then resell it to their customers under a sort of sold by Amazon banner. The user base for Vendor Central is unknown. I'm not aware of any kind of figures around for that, but I would estimate that there's probably at least 50,000 vendors in the UK. So comparable to Seller Central, where I mentioned there's 6 million sellers globally, vendor is obviously a much nicher channel with a smaller kind of customer base. And if you sort of wanted to define each of these business models in a traditional sense, you'd potentially describe Seller Central as a D2C direct to consumer model. The caveat being that these are Amazon's consumers, so direct to Amazon consumer. And you possibly look at Vendor Central as a B2B model. Now, I'm not talking about the end customer that actually purchases the product, but more about the process and the operational relationship in terms of how you function as a business on vendor, in terms of receiving orders, processing shipments, dealing with payments, all that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Amazon vendor, Amazon is a big organization. How does Amazon vendor fit into the broader Amazon ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one thing that people maybe forget is that Amazon originated as an independent retailer, and they were purely on a kind of vendor model. And then in the early 2000s, they sort of recognized the power of bringing in third-party sellers, no doubt influenced by the success of eBay, which is a sort of purely third-party marketplace. It's made up exclusively of third-party sellers. This meant that they could sort of exponentially increase the size of their catalogue and range with minimal financial outlay. Sellers were taking all the risk in terms of stock, warehousing, and Amazon were taking a commission on every sale. So this is what really drove Bezos's ambition for Amazon to become the everything store, because there's no way they could have achieved, you know, the sheer range of products that we see today if it was entirely them, you know, sort of contributing to that. And what's often kind of presented, especially by people who sort of want to downplay vendor or even talk of its demise, is a graph such as this, which shows the, you know, increasing, I suppose, market share of Seller Central over the years. But what this graph kind of ignores is the overall revenue and overall growth that the marketplace has experienced over that period. And okay, Vendor Central, otherwise known as 1P or first party, is, say, under 40% of overall revenue recently, but that still represents, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in annual revenue. So I think it would be stupid to ignore vendor as a channel. In terms of why does it exist, I mean, it's a very strategic channel for Amazon, and on the third party seller side, they don't really have influence and dare I say involvement in the brands and products that are kind of playing in that space. The vendor side is very different. It's essentially got a retail management structure, and vendor managers, who would better be described as category managers, are building strategic relationships with brands big and small, and it gives them a lot more influence in specific categories, especially when they're dealing with category leading brands.
Yeah, and that obviously gives rise to the question, certainly, you know, category leading brands, what's the best path to go down, right? Amazon vendor, Amazon seller, obviously before third party sales existed, Amazon vendor was the only way. There's a lot of views on this particular topic, but I think what I'm more interested in is exploring, you know, how do I know if I'm a suitable brand or vendor or manufacturer for the Amazon vendor platform?
Yeah, I mean, that's a key question, and one that often, you know, gets quite passionate and opinionated, and I often feel that the answers around this are far too subjective. And whilst I'm a kind of vendor advocate, it doesn't necessarily mean that I would push it onto companies where I feel that it's just not a fit. I'm not sure the flip side is true when you've got specialists who are sort of constantly berating vendor and saying that seller is the only way to go. I'd always go in and try and be very objective. It really depends on the business model and lots of other factors. But typically, if you're dealing with wholesale customers, distributors, retailers, rather than directly with your brand's end users, then Vendor Central is likely to be a better fit. It's going to sort of more closely replicate how you're used to doing business in terms of wholesale packs, cartons, pallets, purchase orders, payment terms, etc. And if you look at the order process on Vendor Central, and this is a very simplified representation, but you're receiving a purchase order or purchase orders from Amazon. You're telling them, you know, what you've got in stock. There's no obligation to accept any line items on a purchase order if you don't have the stock. Once you have confirmed that, you'll generate a shipment which needs to be delivered within a fairly tight shipment window, typically 5 working days, and then you raise an invoice. So that's it really in terms of the order process.
So, if I'm a brand, that's used to supplying to traditional retailers, and I'm used to shipping things out of my warehouse in pallets. I mean, is Amazon vendor just basically not a wholesale customer?
Well, not exactly, and this is a kind of common misconception around the channel. But essentially, Amazon are not going to do any of the work for you. You're still going to be fully responsible for your listings, or what I'd like to describe as merchandising. You're in charge of how your brand is represented on the channel. You're still expected to run advertising campaigns, and you really need to have your head in the data. So in many ways, this doesn't differ too much from how you would run a seller account. But that's why it's not kind of how you would have a relationship with your other wholesale customers. Although the operational side kind of might closely match a wholesale relationship, you really need to be in control on the brand and merchandising side. And I think that's where a lot of vendors have become unstuck, really, especially traditional brands who may have been approached by Amazon to join the vendor channel a few years back. All of a sudden, it's become quite a significant revenue driver for them, but they've probably dropped the ball on some or all of these areas, which means that the channel's really not, operating to its full potential. That's why I think it's really important to have someone internally or a team who's kind of got ownership over the channel. And then, you should have appropriate support from companies like yours and mine in terms of strategy, resources, interpreting the data to kind of carry them through as the channel grows. There's a lot to consider and a lot to manage on Amazon. It's a very needy channel, and you can't really afford to drop the ball in any of these areas because there's going to be savvier competitors in your space who are going to take market share from you if you're not kind of plugged into all these different sections.
Yeah, no, that's some really good points there, and actually, it leads me straight into the next topic, which is, and you started to mention them already, but what are some of the key challenges that brands and manufacturers face as they seek to build a sales channel on Amazon? What are the things that you experience, particularly as you work with Amazon vendors across the UK? What do you see?
Yes, the first obstacle is that it's invite only. So not everyone is going to have the opportunity to be a vendor. We do see that the UK vendor team is more open to onboarding vendors at kind of a lower revenue level than, say, the US. We've had experiences where brands have been onboarded who've maybe only got the potential to do about £10,000 a month in revenue, whereas in the US you need to be demonstrating that your brand has the potential to be doing millions of dollars on the channel before they'll accept you onto the program. Biggest pain point, or certainly the thing that's probably talked about most often, is chargebacks, which you don't really see on the seller side, but you need to be very operationally efficient when you're sending stock into Amazon. So in terms of labeling, supplying them with correct information about what you're sending in, the way that certain objects are kind of packaged, that there's a whole host, I believe maybe 15 or 16 categories of chargebacks that are essentially penalties that they will hit you with if you kind of, go outside the realms of those requirements. That can turn into quite a significant problem if it's not really nipped in the bud. There's also shortage claims which relate to if you send stock into Amazon and they believe that they've been short delivered, in many cases they haven't, but it's again something you need to be on top of, because they'll create a shortage based off an invoice that you've raised, which is going to cause discrepancies. It's certainly going to cause headaches for your bookkeeper and accountant. And then there's negotiations. So because this is kind of a wholesale relationship, they have what are called co-op, or terms are actually baked in when you kind of sign up to the account. So they will essentially issue a discount against any invoices that you raise to them, and they'll sort of turn the screw on this typically once a year. So you'll see your terms have kind of increased slightly or maybe significantly in certain areas. So you've just got to often push back. There's many strategies for dealing with that, but again, if you don't keep on top of it, then you're going to see your margin affected to the point where it just might not be profitable. So that's a really important consideration. Another one is price control, because Amazon is the retailer, whereas on Seller Central, you are potentially the retailer, you're setting the pricing. But on Vendor Central, Amazon is the retailer, so they determine what the selling price is. If there's a lot of competition on your listings, resellers, if you're in other retailers, Amazon's going to be scraping those websites. So, there's a chance that you can sort of lose control over the retail pricing, but, there's strategies for mitigating that. Another kind of related topic is cost price increases. So notoriously difficult to get through on Vendor Central. They have actually been a bit more open to this recently, but yeah, if you're trying to get cost price increases through, which is obviously a key topic for probably everyone at the moment, then you're going to have to go through a specific process. You're probably going to have to be patient and expect to be frustrated, and often you might have to make a case for why you need to increase the cost prices. But Amazon is obviously concerned about profitability, so if it's not palatable to them, then they're not going to accept it.
That sounds like quite a few challenges there. At this point, some of our audience might just go, "Hey, let's just switch gears and talk 3P again." Everyone's talking about 3P and Amazon Seller Platform. So surely there must be some benefits, right? You mentioned, maybe there's 50,000 Amazon vendors, I think, in the UK, and maybe I'm misquoting you here, but there must be something going for them, right? So let's talk about some of those positives. What are those benefits that Amazon vendors can expect, and especially, benefits, vis-a-vis being just a third-party seller?
Yeah, I'm at risk of talking it down, but there certainly are some very key benefits, and again, it sort of comes back to it's going to be a specific decision for each brand that's out there. But what I see as kind of key benefits of the vendor channel is you've got this closer relationship with Amazon. Seller Central by comparison is just a kind of anonymous black hole, really, in terms of you're never going to really develop a strategic relationship with anyone at Amazon. The difference on the vendor side is that certainly if you're big enough within your respective category, you're going to get the attention of the vendor manager. They will work with you on things like deals, product portfolio, all sorts of different things to kind of help improve the performance of the channel. If you're not sort of big enough, then you'll probably get an account manager who are also known as a brand specialist. There is a cost kind of incurred with those, but and often it's not necessarily worth it. But if you do have a brand specialist, then you're going to have the weekly meetings, again, where you can discuss strategy, deals, launching new products, and just having that sort of internal stakeholder within Amazon is often useful, particularly for accounts that are having sort of long-standing catalog or sort of technical issues. You've also got better control of your brand because there is actually a hierarchy in terms of catalog, in respect of what Amazon is looking at when updates are being made. If you imagine a listing could have, you know, potentially dozens of contributors in terms of the content, images, all that sort of stuff, it's become increasingly difficult to get kind of basic changes through. And this is a really big problem for brands who've kind of joined the party a bit late. You know, their products have been listed by resellers for many years, and they're trying to kind of take back control of those listings. So as a vendor, the support process is simpler, you know, the support form. There's also a kind of support email, so you can just skip the form entirely for certain accounts. And Amazon will generally look at vendors with brand registry first over sellers who have or have not got brand registry in terms of accepting content changes, getting things pushed through. So for us, that's a really key point when we're trying to tidy up the listings, you know, sort out the merchandising and everything else. Probably the biggest potential advantage is a logistical one. So it's a very different cost structure on Vendor Central in that there's no delivery or storage charges incurred by vendors. You know, Amazon is absorbing all of those costs. So even though you're supplying to Amazon on a wholesale basis, there might be scenarios with products that are priced, you know, quite cheaply. Certainly products that are bulky and heavy. Often it makes a lot more sense, and it's actually more profitable for brands to be supplying those to Amazon on a vendor basis, just because of how the cost is modeled. If you're looking at fulfillment by Amazon on Seller Central, you know, that's a very self-managed platform. You're going to come up against challenges around storage limits, long-term storage fees. You know, you've got to decide how much stock to send in and when. Whereas on Vendor Central, you know, the orders are coming through to you. You're not really having to make as many decisions around what stock to send into Amazon. And I'd also say that the growth potential or the sort of growth curve is quite different on Vendor, because if Amazon sees that your products are generating sales, then they're going to accumulate quite a lot of stock of those products, and they will typically take kind of an 8 to 12 week stock covering, sometimes a lot more, just to ensure that they've got enough stock of those products. So that can often mitigate, you know, the payment terms on Vendor, which are typically 60 days. And, you know, we've looked at accounts where Amazon's got hundreds of thousands of units that they've accumulated in their warehouses. So you can kind of imagine how that looks in terms of the volume and the size of the purchase orders that come through.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And actually, I want to just drill down on one of the things you mentioned earlier. You mentioned sort of different scenarios, maybe creating a different profitability picture. You know, you're taking all the additional costs and all the benefits as well, particularly around logistics. In your experience, you know, what are the typical scenarios under which a brand is likely to, you know, make more margin on the vendor side than the seller side, and perhaps vice versa? Are there some clear examples?
Yeah, and it really comes down to, at a basic level, you've got your selling price and weight and dimensions So certainly for heavy and bulky products, certainly the ones that are at the lower price point, it's going to be really difficult to make any profit from those using fulfillment by Amazon, just because the costs are too high. And also, in certain categories, for example, grocery, obviously the common thing is to be selling in case packs, multi-packs, all that kind of thing. I think where possible, it's always good to try and make individual units available to customers, because that really lowers the barrier to entry in terms of them making a purchase. Now, the challenge is that, when you're dealing with very low price points, say between £3 to £10, again, it often only really makes sense on the vendor side, because the fees are just going to hurt too much if you try and do it on seller. So the answer as always is it depends, but it's quite easily to sort of model the profitability on each channel, because we've got visibility on what the fees are on both.
Yeah, great. Some great insights there, James. Now, we do have a number of questions that have come in from our audience as well. Let me just go through the list. I think there was a question earlier on from Connor Hopkins. He was asking about the advertising capabilities of the vendor platform, particularly how they compare versus the seller platform.
So it's basically identical, because Amazon advertising is actually a separate console. So, whether you're accessing it through Seller Central or Vendor Central, there's no difference in terms of the experience. So yeah, they're exactly the same. The only thing you've got to consider is that, if you're selling to Amazon on a wholesale basis, you've obviously got to dedicate an advertising budget that's going to work for you in terms of profitability. So yeah, that's a really important one to consider.
Thank you. We've got another slightly longer and perhaps more complex question here from Alex. So he's asking, we are vendors, but they, presumably Amazon, aren't letting us control our brand through brand registry. We have a seller account too. How can we have a dialogue with them? They say we have an abusive account. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so my opinion on brand registry is that in many ways, it's not fit for purpose. There should be more control offered to brands and brand owners in order to be able to update content, remove duplicate listings without necessarily filing a trademark infringement. Often what we see is that there is a way to link a brand registry account with a vendor central account, but the visibility that we get on that is basically zero. So you've got to essentially fight with support, usually on a sort of ongoing basis to make sure that there's a proper connection between the two accounts. And then, in terms of the work that we're doing day to day, a lot of the ticket work is catalog based, and we're just having to be quite organized and very relentless in terms of chasing tickets, making sure a ticket doesn't close until it's resolved. And unfortunately, more often than not, you're not going to get the answer you're looking for when you open your first support ticket. So you've just got to keep going at them. Occasionally, you've got to be, I wouldn't say rude, but, request escalations, emphasize if a ticket's been going on for weeks or months that they really need to pull their finger out and look at it. But yeah, it is very challenging dealing with Amazon support, and they're not always as helpful as they could be.
I think we've got time maybe for two questions or comments. There's actually a statement here, and I just want to acknowledge our audience. There's a lot of debate and conversation going on in our chat as well, and I'm trying to pick some questions and a lot of people trying to help each other out there. But I just want to pick up on a comment that that Christopher Coos made, more of a statement, but I'd love to get your perspective on that. So he's saying, labeling, packaging, charges, and operational compliance are very important for the correct management of 1P accounts. I'd love to get your view on that. You're nodding your agreement, but also how do you work with your customers on making sure those processes and those compliance aspects are strong?
Yeah, well, I know Chris very well. I'd say he's actually the authority on this topic. So anything relating to operational aspects, as he says, yeah, if you're not fully compliant in this area, then you're just going to get battered with charges, to be brutally honest. And I've seen vendors where they've pulled away from the channel, or the situation has just got so serious that they can't continue. Now it is always fixable. Very often you need to go to the root, and this is something that both myself and Christopher are quite experienced in. Even if it means going to that client's warehouse to understand what are you doing when you receive a purchase order, how are you creating that advanced shipment notification, what's going on with the labels, what's going on with the pallets, who's delivering them, and how, doing a sort of almost root cause analysis of that process, trying to identify where there's gaps or errors in that process. And there's a number of things you can do to plug those gaps, or utilize more efficient systems or labeling, barcoding. But if you don't do that, and if you're a growing account, the volumes and the workload's going to get only more intense. So it's probably the number one thing to focus on if you are a vendor or want to be a vendor.
We probably have another 5 or 6 questions to choose from, but so I'm trying to pick a different one. I think a very pragmatic one is here from Yanis. He's just asking, if you have not been assigned an Amazon vendor account manager, is there a way you can push Amazon to assign one for you? How do you get a phone number?
So the way that it works at the moment, and unfortunately they've sort of tried to monetize this aspect more and more. So in the good old days, you'd probably be able to get a direct line of communication with a vendor manager, who I sort of described earlier is kind of comparable to a category manager. Whereas these days, they're only going to come in during quite high level discussions for their biggest vendors within their category. So the way that Amazon kind of plugs that gap these days is with brand specialists. So you can certainly request this, and they're going to quote you, usually a kind of percentage of your COGS, cost of goods sold, to have this service. And that really, certainly for smaller and medium-sized vendors, is the only way to get, I suppose, someone internal at Amazon to be focused on your account, to be able to sort of flag and pursue certain issues. But what we've sort of seen more and more recently is that, their level of authority is often quite limited, and the costs of it can sometimes not really make much sense. So again, it really depends on what challenges are being faced by that account. As an agency, we will always try and fill those gaps, and to the point where we're not actually having to rely on Amazon or anyone at Amazon to resolve certain issues. But sometimes it is good or sort of essential to have that point of contact to escalate certain issues. You're on mute, Paul.
Thank you, James. That was very insightful and really sort of practical steps you can take. I really appreciate that. There are a number of comments and questions left. So after we wrap things up, James and I will probably dive into some of those and further clarify and seek to assist where we can. But in terms of this particular webinar, we're going to have to wrap it up here. So James, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. I certainly, and I'm sure the audience agrees with me, really appreciate the expertise you've brought to the table. There's a lot of value in your talk today, and you've certainly helped us demystify, that sort of big Amazon vendor topic, and certainly provided lots of practical tips along the way. So thank you very much. Now, I do want to just prompt you, for viewers that are interested in exploring your services, what is the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, we're kind of a vendor specialist agency. As far as I'm aware, the only one in the UK, potentially in the world. And we've got a team of specialists who are focused on very specific vendor challenges, quite a few of whom have worked at Amazon in fairly senior roles. So yeah, I mean, if anyone's facing any challenges or just wants to discuss strategy, please reach out to me. We've also got a fairly robust audit process. So, we'll go into an account, we'll look at all those aspects that I've kind of outlined earlier in terms of operations, catalog, brand, all the things that contribute to a healthy and sustainable vendor account. We can dig into that and kind of flag where there's potential issues and also opportunities on your vendor account.
Thank you, James. With that, I'd like to wrap things up. Thanks again for coming on the show, and I look forward to maybe doing a follow-up session in the future. That's it for this episode of Marketplace Masters. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to visit Merchant Spring to access exclusive offers only available to viewers of this show. Till next time.